What if your child, lying in a hospital bed with death's shadow already darkening their eyes, pointed to someone you trusted completely and whispered a truth so impossible that believing it would shatter everything you thought you knew about your world? Would you listen? Or would you convince yourself it was just the morphine talking, just the fever dreams of a dying mind grasping at phantoms that didn't exist? Sarah Brennan faced that exact question on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and her answer would either destroy her life or save children she'd never met. This is the story of how the dying see what the living refuse to believe, and how one mother's grief became a weapon against evil, hiding behind a collar and a smile. The fluorescent lights in room 304 of Millbrook General Hospital hummed with the same monotonous drone they'd hummed for the past 8 months. Sarah had learned to hate that sound, the way it filled the silences between her son's labored breaths, the way it never stopped, never changed, never acknowledged that everything else in this room was dying. She sat in the plastic chair that had molded itself to the shape of her exhausted body, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a double shift she'd worked before coming here, before resuming her real job, the one that paid nothing and cost everything. Watching her son fade, Ethan's breathing had changed over the past week, shallower, more deliberate, like his body was practicing for the final performance, rehearsing the moment when it would simply stop trying. The oncologist had stopped using words like treatment options and started using phrases like making him comfortable and quality of remaining time, as if life were something you could measure in tablespoons and Ethan's cup was nearly empty. "Mom?" His voice came out as barely a whisper, thin and reedy as wind through dying grass. Sarah immediately moved to his bedside, taking his hand, so small, so fragile, like holding a bird with hollow bones. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to sound like the mother who'd kissed scraped knees and chased away nightmares, not the woman who was watching those nightmares win. Ethan's eyes, huge in his wasted face, fixed on something behind her. Sarah turned to see Pastor David Holt standing in the doorway, his professional smile of compassion firmly in place, a bouquet of flowers in his hands like an offering to a God who'd stopped listening. "I hope I'm not intruding," Pastor Holt said, his voice carrying that particular melodious quality that made congregations lean forward in their pews every Sunday. "I wanted to check on our brave young warrior." He stepped into the room, and that's when it happened. Ethan's hand clenched around Sarah's fingers with a strength that shouldn't have existed in his depleted body. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating despite the bright lights, and his breath caught in his throat like he'd touched something electrified. The monitors beside his bed began beeping faster as his heart rate spiked. "Ethan? Baby, what's wrong?" Sarah turned back to her son, medical instincts overriding maternal panic, checking his IV line, scanning for signs of seizure or cardiac event. But Ethan wasn't seizing. He was staring past her at Pastor Holt with an expression Sarah had never seen on his face. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when you suddenly understand something terrible. When puzzle pieces you didn't know existed suddenly lock together to reveal a picture you wish you'd never seen. And then Ethan lifted his other hand, the one not clutching his mother's, and pointed directly at the pastor. His finger trembled, but his aim was unwavering, accusatory, certain. His lips moved, forming words that came out in a voice that didn't sound like medication or fever or confusion. It sounded clear. It sounded sure. It sounded like truth. "He's the one," Ethan whispered, his eyes never leaving Pastor Holt's face. "He's the one. He's the one who did it." The flowers in Pastor Holt's hands seemed to wilt in the sudden silence that followed. Sarah looked from her son to the pastor and back again, her mind refusing to process what was happening, categorizing it automatically as symptom, side effect, hallucination. But somewhere deep in her chest, in a place that existed before reason and analysis, before nursing school taught her to trust science over instinct, something cold and ancient whispered, "Listen to him. Your son is trying to tell you something, and you're running out of time to hear it." Pastor Holt's smile never faltered, which somehow made everything worse. A normal person, accused by a dying child, would have shown shock, confusion, maybe even offense. But David Holt simply tilted his head with practiced concern, the way a therapist might regard a patient describing delusions, and said, "The medication makes them see things sometimes. I've witnessed it with other families." He spoke past Ethan as if the boy were already a ghost, his words already meaningless. Sarah felt Ethan's grip tighten on her hand, felt his whole body tensing like a wire about to snap. "Mom, please," he whispered, urgent now, desperate. "Don't let him near me. Don't let him." His words dissolved into coughing, wet and rattling, and Sarah's nursing instincts overrode everything else. She reached for the water cup, adjusted his pillows, checked his oxygen levels. When she looked up again, Pastor Holt had set the flowers on the windowsill and was backing toward the door, his expression a masterpiece of sympathetic sorrow. "I'll leave you two alone," he said softly. "But Sarah, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. The whole congregation is praying for you both." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the chaos of Ethan's ragged breathing. Sarah turned back to her son, smoothing his hair with shaking hands. "It's okay, baby. He's gone. It's just us now." But Ethan wasn't calming down. His eyes were still wide, still terrified, still focused on the doorway, as if expecting the pastor to reappear like a monster from a closet. "You don't believe me," he said, and the resignation in his voice broke something in Sarah's chest. "Nobody ever believes." Ever? The word hung in the air like smoke. What did that mean, ever? Ethan had only met Pastor Holt a handful of times. Hospital visits, Christmas service last year before the treatments got too intense, maybe a few Sunday school classes when he was younger and healthier. There was no ever in their relationship. There was barely an acquaintance. Sarah opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but Ethan's eyes were already drifting closed, exhaustion claiming him the way it always did after these episodes of lucidity. His breathing evened out into the shallow rhythm of medicated sleep, his hand going slack in hers. She sat there in the humming fluorescence, trying to categorize what had just happened into something that made sense. Side effect of morphine? Possible. Confusion brought on by fever. His temperature had been elevated. Some kind of projection. His dying mind assigning blame to a random authority figure because children need someone to be angry at. She'd read about that in grief counseling materials. But then why did her hands keep shaking? Why did that cold whisper in her chest keep insisting? He wasn't confused, he was trying to warn you. Sarah looked at the flowers Pastor Holt had left. White lilies, traditional funeral flowers, she realized with a chill. Who brings funeral flowers to a child who's still alive? She stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the nervous energy crackling through her body. She walked to the window, staring out at Millbrook's main street below. The church steeple was visible from here, white and pristine against the September sky, its cross catching the afternoon sun like a promise. How many times had she sat in those pews? How many times had she listened to David Holt preach about truth and righteousness and protecting the innocent? He'd baptized Ethan when he was 6, before the diagnosis. He'd held her son under that water and brought him up again, declaring him washed clean, born anew in grace. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her best friend Rachel. "How's our brave boy today?" She started to type a response, then stopped. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she tell anyone that Ethan had pointed at their beloved pastor and said, "He's the one," without sounding like she was the one losing her mind? She deleted the unsent message and typed instead, "Sleeping, stable, talk later." It was easier than the truth. It was always easier than the truth. Behind her, Ethan stirred in his sleep, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out, but she could have sworn one of them sounded like "killer," and when she turned back to look at her son, his hand was still raised slightly, still pointing toward where Pastor Holt had stood, as if even in sleep, his body remembered what his waking mind had tried so desperately to tell her. The question was, would she listen before it was too late? Ethan died on a Thursday, 3 days after pointing at Pastor David Holt, 3 days after saying words that Sarah had tried unsuccessfully to forget. He died the way children with leukemia die when medicine has exhausted its arsenal, quietly, slipping away during an afternoon nap while Sarah dozed in the chair beside him, her hand still holding his. One moment his chest was rising and falling in that shallow rhythm she'd memorized over 8 months of vigil. The next moment, it simply stopped. No dramatic final breath, no last words, no movie moment of peaceful closure. Just silence where there had been sound, stillness where there had been life. The monitor's flatline alarm screamed what Sarah's heart already knew, and nurses she worked with every day flooded into the room, going through motions everyone understood were futile, performing the ritual of trying to restart a body that had fought long enough, that had earned its rest. Dr. Morrison called the time of death at 3:47 p.m. Sarah heard herself making sounds that might have been words, felt arms around her that might have been comfort, existed in a space beyond grief where everything felt distant and unreal, like watching her life through water. The funeral was everything a small town does well. Packed church, overflowing casseroles, kind words that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Pastor Holt delivered the eulogy, his voice resonant with practiced sorrow, speaking about God's mysterious plans and angels gaining wings and other platitudes that were supposed to make death make sense. Sarah sat in the front pew, numb and hollow, watching him gesture toward the small white casket, watching him dab at his eyes with a handkerchief, watching him perform grief the way he performed everything else, perfectly, professionally, without a single false note. And all she could think about was Ethan's hand pointing, Ethan's voice saying, "He's the one." Ethan's terror when the pastor approached his bed. She felt Rachel's hand squeeze hers, grounding her, keeping her from standing up and screaming, "What are you hiding in front of everyone who'd come to mourn her son?" After the service, after the cemetery, after the endless procession of neighbors bringing food she couldn't eat and sympathy she couldn't absorb, Sarah finally returned to the house that was too quiet, too empty, too full of absence. She stood in Ethan's doorway, unable to enter, unable to walk away. Well, too, his room still smelled like him, that particular combination of kid and sickness and the dinosaur-shaped soap he'd loved. His astronomy posters still covered the walls. His stuffed brachiosaurus still sat on the pillow, everything waiting for a boy who would never come home. Sarah's sister Emma appeared behind her, touching her shoulder gently. "You should rest. Let me help you pack some of his things." "No." The word came out sharper than Sarah intended. "Not yet. I can't. Not yet." Emma nodded, understanding, retreating downstairs to join the other family members who were trying to keep Sarah from being alone, as if grief were something you could dilute with company. But Sarah needed to be alone, needed to be in this space that still held her son's presence. She stepped into the room, sat on his bed, picked up the brachiosaurus and held it against her chest like it could fill the enormous hole where her heart used to be. That's when she saw it, a corner of paper sticking out from under the mattress. Not unusual. Ethan had always hidden things, little treasures and secrets that made him feel like he had control over something in a life dominated by hospitals and needles and things he couldn't control. Sarah pulled the paper free, expecting a drawing of dinosaurs or spaceships, some artifact of the healthy boy he'd been before cancer rewrote his childhood. What she found instead made her blood go cold. The drawing was done in crayon, the lines shaky from hands weakened by illness, but the image was unmistakable. A small figure, clearly a child, sitting in what looked like a room with a cross on the wall, a church room. The child was crying, tears carefully drawn as blue streaks down the face. Behind the child stood a larger figure, an adult, rendered without features, just a dark silhouette looming. And in the corner, written in Ethan's deteriorating handwriting, words that made Sarah's hands begin to shake, "Pastor David's secret." Sarah stared at the drawing, her mind trying and failing to make it mean something innocent, something explainable. When had Ethan drawn this? Why had he hidden it? How could he possibly know something about Pastor Holt that would make him draw a crying child in a church? Ethan had barely been to church in the past 2 years, had spent almost all his time in hospitals or at home, had no connection to Holt beyond brief pastoral visits. Unless he'd seen something, unless he'd heard something, unless the thing Sarah had dismissed as morphine-induced delusion was actually the desperate attempt of a dying child to expose a truth that adults were too blind, too trusting, too complicit to see. She turned the drawing over, hoping for more context, finding instead another sentence in Ethan's handwriting, this one even shakier, written perhaps in his final days. "He hurt them. I saw. Tell Mom." Sarah's vision blurred with tears that weren't grief anymore but rage, confusion, and a terrible growing certainty that her son's last words hadn't been random. They'd been a mission. He'd been trying to tell her something that mattered more than his own dying. He'd been trying to save someone, and she'd dismissed it as hallucination. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table under the harsh overhead light. Ethan's drawing spread before her like evidence at a crime scene, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Evidence. Proof that her son had known something, seen something, understood something that had terrified him enough to hide it under his mattress, and desperate enough to try telling her with his last conscious breaths. She'd photographed the drawing from every angle, terrified it might somehow disappear, That grief might be making her see things that weren't there, but the image remained constant. The crying child, the looming figure, the damning words in her son's handwriting. At 6 a.m., unable to wait any longer, she called Detective Marcus Webb. She'd known Marcus since she was a teenager, had dated his nephew briefly in high school, trusted him as much as she trusted anyone in Millbrook's small police department. His voice was groggy when he answered. "Sarah, everything okay? How did you answer that question when nothing would ever be okay again? I need to see you. It's about Ethan. It's about something Marcus, I found something and I think..." Her voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence because finishing it would make it real, would require her to say out loud what her mind had been screaming all night. Marcus met her at the station an hour later, his face lined with concern and something that looked like pity. He led her to a small interview room, poured coffee she didn't drink, and waited while she laid out the drawing on the table between them. "Ethan drew this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I found it hidden under his mattress after the funeral. And before he died, Marcus, he pointed at Pastor Holt and said, 'He's the one.' He said he hurt them. He was terrified every time the pastor came near him." She watched Marcus's face as he studied the drawing, watched his expression shift from concern to discomfort to something that looked dangerously close to dismissal. "Sarah," he said carefully, the way you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge, "I know you're going through hell right now. Losing a child. There's nothing worse. And grief can make us see patterns that aren't there, can make us need someone to blame." "I'm not looking for someone to blame," she interrupted, anger flaring hot and sudden. "I'm telling you my son tried to warn me about something before he died. Look at this drawing. Read what he wrote." Marcus sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. "I see a drawing made by a very sick child who'd been on heavy medication for months. Kids draw scary things sometimes, Sarah. It means something," she insisted. "Why would he specifically write Pastor David's name? Why would he point at him? Why would he say..." "Because children sometimes fixate on authority figures when they're processing trauma," Marcus said, his tone maddeningly gentle, maddeningly reasonable. "The pastor visited him in the hospital. Maybe something about those visits scared him in his confused state. Maybe the morphine made him associate the pastor with his own dying, with the church, with... I don't know, Sarah, but I can't launch an investigation into one of the most respected men in this community based on a dying child's drawing and a few confused words." The phrase "confused words" landed like a slap. Sarah felt something inside her harden, crystallize into determination that bordered on obsession. "So you won't even look into it? Won't even ask questions?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Ask what questions?" "Pastor Holt, did you hurt children because a boy dying of leukemia drew a picture? You know what that would do? It would destroy his reputation, destroy his family, destroy his ministry, and for what? For a mother's grief-driven suspicion that has no basis in..." "In what?" Sarah demanded. "In reality? My son is my reality, Marcus. Was. And he died trying to tell me something. And you're sitting here telling me to ignore it because it might be inconvenient?" The silence that followed was thick with unspoken things. Marcus's pity, Sarah's rage, the vast gulf between what she knew in her bones and what she could prove in a court, or even in a conversation. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice heavy with reluctance. "I'll tell you what I can do. I'll keep my eyes open. If anything at all comes across my desk that involves Pastor Holt, I'll pay attention. But Sarah, I need you to hear me. I can't investigate someone based on this. I don't have probable cause. I don't have any complaint. I don't have anything except a drawing from a sick child and a mother who just buried her son. I'm sorry, but that's not enough." Sarah stood, gathering the drawing, feeling the weight of her isolation settle over her like a burial shroud. "It was enough for Ethan," she said quietly. "It was important enough that he used some of his last energy to try to make me understand. But I guess a dying child's words don't matter as much as a pastor's reputation." She walked out before Marcus could respond, before he could offer more sympathy or more reasons why the truth didn't matter as much as maintaining the comfortable lie that evil couldn't possibly exist in a man who smiled from the pulpit every Sunday. The morning sun was too bright, too cheerful, mocking her with its normalcy. Sarah stood in the parking lot holding the drawing and made a decision that would either vindicate her son's final warning or destroy what remained of her life. If the police wouldn't investigate, she would, and she wouldn't stop until she knew why Ethan had pointed at David Holt with his dying breath. Sarah's investigation began the way most desperate searches do, with Google at 2 a.m. and coffee going cold beside her laptop. She started with the basics: David Holt's history, his credentials, the timeline of his ministry. What she found seemed unremarkable at first: seminary in Tennessee, missionary work in Guatemala, pastoral positions in Florida, Georgia, and then Millbrook. A typical career trajectory for a man of faith. But something nagged at her, a pattern she couldn't quite articulate. Why so many moves? Pastors typically stayed longer than 2 or 3 years in a single congregation. Holt had moved 4 times in 12 years before settling in Millbrook. She began calling his previous churches, claiming to be verifying references for a community outreach program, keeping her voice professional, hiding the tremor of obsession that had taken root in her chest. The first 2 churches were dead ends, secretaries who remembered Pastor Holt fondly, who wished him well, who had nothing but praise. But the 3rd church, Grace Community in Pensacola, Florida, gave her something different. Not information exactly, but hesitation. A pause that lasted too long when she asked about Holt's tenure there. "I really can't comment on personnel matters," the secretary said, her voice tight with something that sounded like discomfort. "You'd need to speak with our board, and they're very particular about—" "Was there an incident?" Sarah asked, abandoning pretense. "Something that made him leave?" Another pause. Then quietly, "I've said too much already. I'm sorry." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, her heart pounding. There was something there. Something buried. Something that made a church secretary nervous 7 years later. She checked her bank account. The savings she'd accumulated during Ethan's illness. Money she'd planned to use for final treatments that never came. Money that now sat like blood money, purposeless. She bought a plane ticket to Pensacola that same day. Her sister Emma called while she was packing, her voice sharp with worry. "Mom said you're flying to Florida? Sarah, you just buried your son 5 days ago. You need to rest, you need to grieve, I need to know why he died trying to tell me something," Sarah interrupted, throwing clothes into a suitcase without looking at them. "I need to know if I failed him by not listening." "You didn't fail him," Emma said, her voice breaking. "You were with him every single day. You gave him everything. Except belief," Sarah said flatly. "When he tried to warn me, I thought he was confused. I dismissed it. And now I need to know if he was right. Because if he was right, Emma, if there's even a chance he was right, then there are other children who need someone to believe them too." She landed in Pensacola on a Wednesday afternoon, rented a car, and drove to Grace Community Church with no plan beyond knocking on doors until someone gave her answers. The church was smaller than Millbrook's, brick and modest, sitting in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. She tried the main office first, asking for information about David Holt's time there, watching the current secretary's face close like a door. "That was before my time," the woman said, which was obviously a lie given the photos on her desk that dated back at least 10 years. Sarah was about to push harder when a voice behind her said, "I remember him." Sarah turned to see a woman in her early 20s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that held the particular wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Pastor Holt?" the woman continued. "I remember him very well, and if you're here asking questions about him, I think maybe we should talk somewhere that isn't here." They met at a diner 3 blocks away, sitting in a back booth where the afternoon light couldn't quite reach. The woman introduced herself as Jennifer Marks, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and sat with her hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. "What did he do?" Sarah asked, unable to wait, unable to perform small talk when her son's final words were burning in her memory. Jennifer looked at her for a long moment, assessing, deciding. Then she said, "He abused me for 2 years, starting when I was 11 years old. During summer church camps, in his office after youth group, anywhere he could get me alone. And when I finally told my parents, nobody believed me. They said I was confused, that I was acting out, that a man like Pastor Holt would never—" Her voice cracked, steadied. "My family was ostracized. We left the church, left town. He was quietly transferred to another congregation and everyone pretended it never happened. I'm 23 years old now, and I still can't walk into a church without feeling like I'm going to suffocate." Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she had to press them flat against the table. "My son?" she whispered. "My son tried to tell me. Before he died, he pointed at Holt and said, 'He's the one.' He drew a picture of a child crying in a church. He knew, somehow he knew, and I didn't believe him fast enough." Jennifer reached across the table, her hand covering Sarah's. "Then believe him now," she said, and help me make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Sarah returned to Millbrook with Jennifer's testimony recorded on her phone and a fire in her chest that grief had transmuted into purpose. She went directly to Detective Webb, placed her phone on his desk, and pressed play. When Jennifer's voice filled the small office, describing in clinical detail what David Holt had done to her, Webb's face transformed from skepticism to horror. "There are others," Sarah said when the recording ended. "Jennifer helped me find 2 more families who left Millbrook in the past 3 years. Families with children who attended Holt's youth groups. Families who left suddenly, quietly, without explanation. I have their numbers. They're willing to talk now that they know they weren't alone." Webb sat back in his chair, looking like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "He's been doing this for years, moving from church to church, and everyone just looked the other way," Sarah finished. "Because it's easier to dismiss a child's accusation than to believe a respected man could be a monster. My son saw it somehow, Marcus. He knew, and he died trying to warn me, and I'm not going to let his warning be for nothing." The investigation moved quickly once it began. Search warrants for Holt's home computer revealed encrypted files containing images that made hardened detectives physically ill. 5 victims came forward from Millbrook alone. Children who'd been too afraid to speak. Parents who'd noticed changes in their children but never imagined why. The youngest victim was 7 years old. When Marcus arrested David Holt outside his church on a Sunday morning, the pastor's mask finally cracked. His lawyer arrived within the hour, but the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, damningly comprehensive. Sarah watched from across the street as they led him away in handcuffs. This man who'd stood over her son's casket and spoken about God's mercy. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a hollow ache where vindication should have been. Ethan was still gone. The children Holt had hurt were still hurt. Justice couldn't undo any of it. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Jennifer testified first, her voice steady, her courage giving strength to the others who followed. Sarah attended every day, sitting in the back row, holding Ethan's drawing in her lap like a talisman. When the verdict came, guilty on 14 counts, the courtroom erupted in tears, relief, rage. Holt was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He would die behind bars. The judge specifically mentioned Ethan in her closing remarks, saying, "Sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths." This child's courage in his final days helped save others from the same fate. His mother's refusal to dismiss his words brought a predator to justice. Let that be remembered. After the sentencing, Sarah drove to Millbrook Cemetery alone. She knelt beside Ethan's grave, placing fresh dandelions, his favorite, on the still raw earth. "You were right, baby," she whispered. "You saw what no one else could see. You saved them. I'm sorry I didn't believe you fast enough, but I believe you now. I'll always believe you now." The wind picked up, scattering dandelion seeds across the cemetery, each one carrying a wish into the world. Sarah watched them fly and thought about all the children who'd been saved because one dying boy had pointed at his killer with his last strength. She thought about truth and courage, and the terrible price of both. She thought about how the dead sometimes see more clearly than the living, and how love doesn't end just because breath does. As she stood to leave, she noticed another mother kneeling at a nearby grave, a young girl's grave, fresh flowers in her trembling hands. The woman looked up, met Sarah's eyes, and in that moment, Sarah saw recognition, the look of someone carrying an impossible story, a warning no one believed, a truth too terrible to ignore. Sarah took a breath and walked toward her, because sometimes the work of believing the unbelievable never ends. Sometimes justice is just the beginning, and sometimes the dead leave missions for the living to finish. Another head-spinning tale, where truth turns against its believer, and the smallest voice shatters the loudest lies.